All right, let me tell you something that's been bothering me lately. We need to talk about what's happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm not talking about the weather or the Vikings. I'm talking about something far more concerning, something that should make every American taxpayer absolutely furious. Minnesota has apparently decided to compete for the title of fraud capital of America. And folks, they're winning. They're not just winning, they're dominating this competition in ways that would make even the most creative scammers jealous. Miami used to hold this title, but Minnesota said, "Hold my beer," and they absolutely crushed it. So let's break this down systematically, because what's happening there isn't just one isolated incident. It's a pattern, a very concerning pattern that involves hundreds of millions of dollars, organized crime tactics, and political corruption that would make a mob movie look tame. I mean, when prosecutors literally say something is straight out of a mob movie, you know, things have gone completely off the rails. First, let's talk about feeding our future. This is the big one. Over $200 million in fraud. Let me say that again. $200 million. That's not a typo. That's not an exaggeration. That's actual taxpayer money that was supposed to feed children during the pandemic. Children, hungry children. During a pandemic, that's the money these people decided to steal. Now, you might think, okay, big fraud case, the feds caught them, they're prosecuting everyone, case closed, right? Wrong. So, incredibly wrong. Here's where it gets interesting. They've already charged 76 people. 76 over 70 have either been convicted or pleaded guilty. That's not a fraud ring. That's practically an industry. That's a full-scale organized criminal enterprise operating in plain sight. And the investigation isn't over. It's still ongoing. They're still finding more people involved in this massive scheme. But wait, it gets better or worse, depending on how you look at it. Meet Abdi Wahab Muhammad. This guy is accused of stealing $17.5 million. Let me walk you through his alleged operation, because it's actually quite fascinating from a systems perspective, albeit completely illegal and morally bankrupt. Muhammad allegedly claimed he was feeding 5,000 kids a day during the pandemic. 5,000 kids every single day. That's a lot of meals, right? That requires a lot of infrastructure, a lot of logistics, a lot of actual children being fed, except here's the thing, he wasn't feeding anyone. According to prosecutors, he was just making it all up. But you can't just say you're feeding 5,000 kids without providing names, right? The government needs documentation. They need lists. They need proof. So what did this guy allegedly do? He used a spreadsheet and a website called listofrandomnames.com. I'm not making this up. Listofrandomnames.com. He literally generated fake children's names from a random name generator website and then submitted those as his meal count sheets. Think about that for a second. The level of audacity here is almost impressive. Almost. If it wasn't stealing from taxpayers and a program meant to feed actual hungry children. But it gets even more interesting. Muhammad allegedly used this fraud money to buy a building on East Lake Street. And then, in what I can only describe as the most brazen move possible, he threw a party in that building, a party honoring Amy Bach, who is allegedly the mastermind behind the entire Feeding Our Future fraud operation. And guess who showed up to this party? Politicians. Minneapolis City Council member Jamal Osman, State Senator Omar Fateh. They were right there partying it up in a building allegedly purchased with stolen taxpayer money meant for feeding hungry kids. Now, I'm not saying these politicians knew about the fraud at the time, but come on. This is the kind of thing that makes people lose faith in the entire system. You've got politicians rubbing elbows with people who are actively defrauding the government, and nobody seems to think that's a problem until the feds come knocking. But Muhammad's alleged fraud operation didn't stop with a fake meal program. Oh no. Prosecutors say he also billed the Department of Human Services for a so-called adult daycare he owned called Minnesota Senior Center. He allegedly received $500,000 for that in 2020. And on top of that, they say he fraudulently applied for COVID-era small business loans through Hennepin County. This guy allegedly had multiple fraud schemes running simultaneously. That takes organization. That takes planning. That takes a complete lack of moral compass. Now, Muhammad is scheduled to go on trial He's the only one among his 7 co-defendants who hasn't pleaded guilty. Everyone else looked at the evidence and said, yeah, we're done here, we're pleading out. But not Mohammed. He's going to trial, or at least he was supposed to go to trial as a free man. Here's where things get absolutely wild. Just 2 weeks before his trial is set to begin, Mohammed gets arrested. Why? Witness tampering. The guy allegedly couldn't help himself. He had to go intimidate a witness. And not just any witness, but one of his co-defendants who had already agreed to testify against him. Let me paint you a picture of what allegedly happened. Mohammed goes to the Mall of America, specifically to Nickelodeon Universe, which is this big indoor theme park. There's a witness sitting on a bench, just minding their own business. Mohammed allegedly walks up, stands over them in what I can only imagine was a very intimidating posture, calls them a snitch, and makes them promise not to testify against him. In a mall, at a theme park, with cameras everywhere, with witnesses everywhere, the sheer stupidity of this move is staggering. If you're going to tamper with a witness, which you absolutely should not do because it's illegal and wrong, maybe don't do it in one of the most surveilled locations in the entire state of Minnesota. The witness, understandably terrified, reported this to prosecutors. And that's when Mohammed's pretrial freedom came to a screeching halt. The judge said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I cannot ensure a fair trial if witnesses are scared to testify before a jury." So Mohammed was taken into custody by the U.S. Marshal, and he's not getting out until this trial is over. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's pretty bad, but at least it's just one guy trying to intimidate one witness. Nope. This isn't even the first example of witness intimidation or jury tampering in the Feeding Our Future cases. Remember when I said this stuff is straight out of a mob movie? Here's why. Last summer, during the first Feeding Our Future trial involving 7 defendants, something absolutely insane happened. Before the case went to the jury, a woman showed up at the home of one of the jurors, not just any juror, but specifically one juror who had been researched and followed. This woman dropped off a bag. Want to guess what was in the bag? $120,000 in cash. $120,000 to bribe a juror in a federal case in 2024. Let me ask you something. What would you do if someone showed up at your house and handed you a bag with $120,000 in cash? Would you take it and vote the way they wanted, or would you immediately call the FBI? Because that's what this juror did. They called the authorities, and this attempted bribery made international headlines. People around the world were asking, what the hell is going on in Minnesota? Prosecutors charged 5 people involved in researching and following that juror. 5 people were part of this conspiracy to bribe a juror in a federal fraud case. The 5th and final defendant in that bribery case just pleaded guilty last month. Think about that. They actually tried to bribe a juror with a briefcase full of cash like it's 1975 and they're in a mafia film. So we've got massive fraud, fake children being used to steal government money, witness tampering at shopping malls, and literal bags of cash being delivered to jurors' homes. And the investigation is still ongoing. They're still finding more people involved. This thing is like an onion. Every layer they peel back reveals another layer of corruption and fraud underneath. But wait, we're not done with Minnesota yet. Because the Feeding Our Future fraud isn't the only sketchy thing happening in Minneapolis right now. Let's talk about your boy, Omar Fateh. State Senator Omar Fateh is running for Minneapolis mayor, and he had something that's pretty valuable in politics. He had the endorsement of the Minneapolis Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is basically the Democratic Party in Minnesota. Except there's a problem. The endorsement process was, let's say, irregular. The state DFL party looked at how the Minneapolis convention went down and said, nope, something's not right here. There were problems with the voting process. There were irregularities. So the state party did something pretty unprecedented. They yanked his endorsement. They said, we're revoking this endorsement because the process that got you this endorsement was flawed. The Minneapolis DFL appealed that decision. They lost. The endorsement is officially revoked. Omar Fateh is not the DFL endorsed candidate for Minneapolis mayor. This is official. This is on the record. Everyone knows this. So naturally, what does the Fateh campaign do? They keep telling everyone he's endorsed. They print up yard signs saying he's DFL endorsed. They send out mailers with his face on them claiming he has the DFL endorsement. They put it on his website. They're just acting like the endorsement was never revoked. Now, you might think, okay, maybe this is just some confusion. Maybe the mailers were printed before the endorsement was revoked, and they're just now being delivered. And that's actually what the Minneapolis DFL is claiming. They say they printed the postcards before the August decision to revoke the endorsement, and slow delivery times meant some postcards arrived after the decision. But here's the thing. The yard signs are still up. The website still claims the endorsement. This isn't a delivery timing issue at this point. This is a deliberate choice to continue claiming an endorsement that has been officially revoked. And there are consequences for this. A Hennepin County court just fined Fateh's campaign $500 for handing out yard signs claiming he was DFL endorsed after the party rescinded that endorsement. $500. That's it. That's the penalty for misleading voters about a major party endorsement. I've gotten parking tickets that were more expensive than that. The cost-benefit analysis here is pretty obvious. Pay $500, keep claiming the fake endorsement, probably gain way more than $500 worth of campaign contributions and voter support from people who think you're officially endorsed. And now the Minnesota DFL is investigating the Minneapolis DFL party delegates over these misleading mailers. So you've got the state party investigating the local party for sending out materials that contradict the official decision to revoke an endorsement. The Minneapolis DFL delegates are claiming they have invoices proving the mailers were ordered before the announcement and that slow delivery caused the issue. But even if that's true for the mailers, it doesn't explain the yard signs, the website, and the continued claims of endorsement. This is local politics at its finest, folks. Irregularities in the endorsement process, revoked endorsements, continued false claims of endorsement, investigations into party delegates, and fines that are so small they're basically just the cost of doing business. It's not quite as dramatic as bribing jurors with bags of cash, but it's the same underlying problem. People who think the rules don't apply to them, or that the rules are just suggestions they can ignore if it's politically convenient. But we're still not done with Minnesota, because I saved the best for last. Let's talk about ILHAN OMAR. Congresswoman ILHAN OMAR is one of the most controversial members of Congress, probably ever. And there's been this persistent allegation for years now that she married her brother to help him get United States residency. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory. And maybe it is. But here's the thing. There are documents that have been circulating online for years. You can find them on social media pretty easily. Marriage records, immigration documents, all sorts of stuff that people have analyzed and reanalyzed trying to figure out if this allegation is true. Problem is, there's never been definitive proof one way or the other. It's always been in this weird gray area where there's enough smoke that people keep asking questions, but not enough fire that anyone has been able to definitively prove anything, until potentially now. Benny Johnson is a very popular political commentator and YouTuber with millions of followers, and he recently made a pretty explosive claim. He says he's close with a lot of people at the Department of Homeland Security, and according to his sources, there's allegedly a considerable amount of demonstrable evidence that the government has that proves this allegation is true. Now, I want to be very careful here. This is not confirmed. This is Benny Johnson citing unnamed sources at Homeland Security. But if what he's saying is true, this is massive. We're talking about a sitting member of Congress potentially having committed immigration fraud to help a family member gain residency in the United States. According to Johnson, the government has this evidence, and they're apparently trying to figure out which way to go with it. It's obviously a touchy issue. You've got a sitting congresswoman. You've got allegations that go back 15 years or so. You've got political implications that would be absolutely explosive. So apparently they're deciding whether to move forward with this or not. Here's what makes this particularly interesting. If the Department of Homeland Security actually has solid evidence of immigration fraud, that's not a political issue. That's a legal issue. Immigration fraud is a federal crime. It doesn't matter if you're a congresswoman or a regular citizen. If you committed fraud to help someone gain residency or citizenship, that's illegal. But bringing charges against a sitting member of Congress is obviously complicated. There are political ramifications. There are questions about timing, about motivations, about whether this is legitimate law enforcement or political persecution. And those are legitimate questions to ask. At the same time, if someone committed immigration fraud, they should be held accountable regardless of their position. The law should apply equally to everyone. That's kind of the whole point of having laws in the first place. You don't get a pass on federal crimes just because you got elected to Congress. Now, Congresswoman Nancy Mace tried to address this in Congress. She put forward a privileged resolution condemning remarks made by Ilhan Omar and saying she shouldn't be on the Foreign Affairs Committee given her rhetoric. It was basically a censure motion. And what happened? Republicans blocked it. Republicans tabled the motion. Some made excuses about the First Amendment. And look, the First Amendment is incredibly important. Freedom of speech is fundamental to our democracy. But the First Amendment doesn't protect you from consequences. It protects you from government censorship, but it doesn't mean you can say whatever you want without any professional or political consequences. And when you have a code of ethics in Congress, which they do, there should be consequences for violating that code. The whole situation is frustrating because there seems to be evidence of significant wrongdoing, but the political will to actually investigate and potentially prosecute doesn't seem to be there. And that's a problem. If we have a two-tier justice system where regular people get prosecuted for crimes but powerful politicians get a pass, that undermines faith in the entire legal system. So let's take a step back and look at the big picture here. What are we seeing in Minnesota? We're seeing massive organized fraud involving hundreds of people and hundreds of millions of dollars. We're seeing witness tampering and jury bribery that sounds like it's from a mob movie. We're seeing political candidates continuing to claim endorsements they don't have and facing minimal consequences. And we're seeing potential immigration fraud by a sitting congresswoman that may or may not ever be properly investigated. This isn't just about Minnesota. This is about accountability. This is about whether our systems of government and justice actually work. When you have fraud operations involving 76 people and over $200 million, something has systemically failed. That's not just a few bad actors. That's the entire infrastructure of fraud that was able to operate for years. When you have people literally trying to bribe jurors with bags of cash in 2024, we've got a serious problem. That level of brazenness suggests people don't actually fear consequences. They think they can get away with it. When you have political candidates facing $500 fines for misleading voters about major party endorsements, the cost of breaking the rules is so low that it's rational to break them. That's not a functioning system of accountability. That's a system that incentivizes bad behavior. And when you potentially have evidence of federal crimes by sitting members of Congress, but there's no political will to investigate, we're basically admitting that powerful people play by different rules than everyone else. So here's what concerns me most. These aren't isolated incidents. They're happening in the same place, involving overlapping groups of people at the same time. That suggests something deeper is broken. It suggests a culture where fraud and corruption are normalized, where people see others getting away with things and think, well, if they can do it, why can't I? The Feeding Our Future fraud didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because people saw an opportunity, knew others who were doing similar things, and figured they could get away with it too. That's how you end up with 76 people charged in a single fraud scheme. It spreads like a virus through communities and networks. And here's the really frustrating part. Most of this money was supposed to help people. It was supposed to feed hungry children during a pandemic. It was supposed to support seniors at adult daycare centers. It was supposed to help small businesses survive during COVID lockdowns. These were programs designed to help Americans during one of the most difficult periods in recent history. Instead, criminals saw these programs as opportunities. They saw emergency funding with relaxed oversight as a chance to steal. They took money meant for the most vulnerable people and bought buildings and threw parties and lived large while children went hungry. That's not just illegal, it's morally bankrupt. The pandemic exposed a lot of weaknesses in our systems. The speed at which money needed to go out meant that normal checks and balances were relaxed. Applications that would normally take months were approved in weeks or days. Oversight that would normally catch fraud before it happened was scaled back to get help to people faster. And criminals exploited that. They saw the opportunity and they took it. And now we're spending years and millions of dollars in law enforcement resources trying to claw back stolen money and prosecute all these people. Money that could have gone to actually helping people is instead going to investigations and prosecutions. That's the real cost of fraud. It's not just the money that was stolen. It's the money that never made it to people who actually needed it. It's the resources spent on enforcement instead of services. It's the erosion of trust in government programs. It's people who legitimately need help being afraid to apply because the process has become so scrutinized and difficult in response to the fraud. So what's the solution here? How do we fix this? Well, first, we need real accountability. Not $500 fines, not slaps on the wrist, actual consequences that make people think twice before committing fraud. When someone steals $17 million, they need to go to prison for a very long time. When someone tries to bribe a juror, they need to face serious federal charges. When politicians lie about endorsements, they need to face consequences that actually matter. Second, we need better systems. The fact that someone could generate random names from a website and use those to claim millions in government funding is absurd. We have the technology to verify identities, to check if children actually exist, to ensure that meals are actually being served. We need to use it. Yes, it might slow things down slightly. Yes, it might add some bureaucracy. But it's worth it if it prevents hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud. Third, we need cultural change. This pattern of fraud suggests a culture where people think they can get away with it, where they see others doing it and figure they will too. We need to make it clear that fraud will be caught, prosecuted, and punished severely. We need whistleblowers to feel safe coming forward. We need investigators to have the resources they need. We need prosecutors to prioritize these cases. And fourth, we need political accountability. If politicians are attending parties thrown by people who are actively defrauding the government, even if they didn't know about the fraud at the time, they need to answer for that. If candidates are lying about endorsements, voters need to hold them accountable. If members of Congress potentially committed immigration fraud, that needs to be investigated regardless of the political implications. The bottom line is this: what's happening in Minnesota is a symptom of larger problems in how we handle fraud, corruption, and accountability in this country. The specific details might be unique to Minnesota, but the underlying issues exist everywhere. We have systems that make fraud relatively easy and consequences relatively mild. That's a recipe for disaster, and it's not sustainable. Eventually, people lose faith in institutions completely. They stop believing that government can do anything effectively. They stop trusting that the legal system applies equally to everyone. They stop participating in democratic processes because they think it's all rigged anyway. That's how democracies fail. So, yeah, I'm bothered by what's happening in Minnesota. I'm bothered by the scale of the fraud. I'm bothered by the brazenness of the criminal activity. I'm bothered by the weak political accountability. And I'm bothered by what it says about our systems and our culture. We can do better than this. We have to do better than this. Because if we just shrug and say, well, that's just how things are, then we're admitting defeat. We're saying that fraud and corruption are just part of the system now and there's nothing we can do about it. And I refuse to accept that. The people involved in the Feeding Our Future fraud need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The people who tried to bribe jurors need to face serious consequences. Political candidates who lie to voters need to lose elections. And if there's evidence of federal crimes by sitting members of Congress, that evidence needs to be investigated properly and impartially. That's not radical, that's not partisan, that's just basic accountability. That's what a functioning system of justice looks like. And right now, based on what's happening in Minnesota, we don't have that. We have a system where fraud is rampant, accountability is weak, and consequences are minimal. And that needs to change. The question is whether we have the political will to actually change it, or whether we're just going to keep watching these stories, shaking our heads, and moving on to the next news cycle without actually fixing anything. I really hope it's the former, because we can't afford much more of the latter.